Bandits and Boars. Chapter 1. The Lord's Hunt. It was the day of the hunt, and all was being made ready. In a damp, thatched-roofed hut, Fletchers prepared the 900 arrows needed for the hunt, while in the village serfs put up banners and wreaths of straw and flowers. Others prepared the bonfire and spit. For the community boar. Courtesy of Lord Theo Farno. Back at the estate, the squires sharpened the boar spears with smooth river stones to a razor's edge. Lord Theo Farno and his son Alfred were being dressed in their respective quarters in preparation for the day's festivities, while Theo Farno's stable keeper Otto prepared the finest mares with the help of several squires. "Tighter on the straps," Atto shouted over at a squire. He walked over to him and slapped the saddle. It slid to one side of the horse. "A buffeted ankle for the lord or his son could be a hanging for you, boy," Otto asserted loudly to the squire with a piercing stare. Just outside the stables, knights dressed in huntsman grey cowls and squires prepared their armaments, filling quills with arrows, tightening their bootstraps and bowstrings while the early morning fog billowed around them. Sir Harold, the hunt's lead, instructed the flag-bearers, rehearsing them in the appropriate cards for the hunt. Harold knew Theo Farno would tolerate no blunders except them being his own, and he would ensure there would be none. An hour later, the hunting party, having been prepared, along with Theo Farno and Alfred, marched towards the King's Forest. Theo Farno dressed in the customary royal purple beside him, his son Alfred in bright forest green to signify him as the most skillful hunter. In consideration of himself, Alfred wore the heavy leather and wool forest green cowl as a formality. The title of most skillful hunter was not much considered amongst Alfred and his friends in the hunting party, much less amongst the huntsmen and foresters of the townships. Hunting for many of the kingdom's people was a way of life and a crucial role of survival for more. Theo Farno pulled back on the bridle, halting his horse, lifting his left arm palm forward. With that, the first card was played. In chaotic unison, members from all parties aligned themselves into a nearly perfect formation. Flagmen waved their flags and planted one. Harold signalled again, and the two hunting parties walked and rode over the dew-soaked grass into the dense oak and pine-shaded forest. Alfred accompanied one group still atop his horse, Lord Theophano and Harold with the other. In the forest, Alfred quietly talked with his friend and most trusted knight and guardsman, Robert. But soon the pair were interrupted when they got sight of a large boar mozzling the ground in search of food a ways in front of them. Alfred raised his open right hand and clenched it into a fist, commanding the party to halt. He dismounted, then motioned with his left hand, shaking his middle and pinky fingers at a tree 900 yards to the left of the foraging boar, signalling to Robert to surround the animal. Robert would fire an arrow into the boar's side, drawing its attention to him, and as it ran towards him, Alfred would intercept and spear the beast. Sir Robert silently crept over and crouched by a tree. 40 paces back, and 25 yards to the right of Robert, Alfred made the sign for Robert to fire, shaking his left hand, middle finger and thumb pointing toward the boar. The party quietly watched at a short distance. Robert's arrow chased through the trees, striking the boar above its left eye. The beast squealed in pain, "Die!" and Robert jumped out from behind the tree, shouting, "Ah!" as he stomped repeatedly at the ground. Pausing for just a moment, the boar looked up at Robert with ferocity and charged towards him, snarling. With the massive boar distracted, Alfred ran swiftly, and about 5 paces from Robert, Alfred thrust his spear, blocking the foe, piercing it just above its left shoulder. The animal snorted, squealed, and struggled. Still trying to charge forward wildly and gore Alfred, it impaled itself further up the spear but was blocked from charging further by the iron cross of the boar's spear. Alfred was pushed back. Boots sliding across the dirt, he dug his feet into the earth. Ah! Alfred let out a shout, forcing himself to gather his strength. The rest of the hunting party marched forwards. Robert ran towards the warring pair, arming himself with his large hunting knife. But, as Alfred noticed him approaching, he commanded him to stay aside, Alfred wanting the kill for himself. Robert, fearing for his noble master and friend, reluctantly obeyed the order. He stopped, and watching from a short distance, he sheathed his knife. Alfred strengthened his grip and fastened the spear under his left arm, squeezing it to his body. He carefully removed his right hand from the spear and grabbed his knife. Alfred leaned forwards, right arm outstretched, attempting to slide forwards on his spear and slit the snarling beast's throat as he held it back. Knife in hand, waiting for the boar to raise its head and make way for his knife to slash at its neck. The young master had single-handedly taken boars many times on and off horseback, but in the heat of the struggle his grip to the spear slipped. His spear slid back from under his arm. Instantly bewildered, he dropped his knife and tried catching it and reaffirming his stance, but the boar was too fast. It charged towards him with its head down, then lifting its face, bucked up, goring Alfred just beneath his left cheekbone. The beast's muddy tusk pierced him, tearing and snapping through Alfred's flesh and bone. Lifting Alfred off the ground and flinging him into the air, Robert shouted, trying to draw the beast's attention, and charged as Alfred hit the ground. The rest of the hunting party also charged forward, one of them blowing a horn to signify to the other group that something had gone terribly wrong. Robert, charging forwards, grabbed Alfred's spear that hung from the boar's shoulder, managing to grab it firmly and hold the beast back as it pushed towards him. Two other huntsmen ran forwards and stabbed the boar on its left. Robert looked quickly to where Alfred had landed, seeing two squires hunched over Alfred as a monk approached. Filled with rage, Robert looked back to the boar and thrust it forward and twisted with Alfred's spear. The two spear-wielding knights to the right followed suit, pushing deeper into the beast's left ribs and hip. The massive boar growled and toppled over on its side. Crunching dried sticks and leaves, the earth shook around the men, the boar's thick legs furiously beating against the air and the muddy ground. Shouting and panting, the hunters twisted and pressed with their spears till the blood-eye boar growled, winced, then with a last breath lay motionless. Robert removed Alfred's spear and stabbed it into the ground next to him. Again he unsheathed his large hunting knife. Standing over the beast, Robert grabbed a tuft of its hair. Lifting its head, he stabbed, his knife firmly sliding into the left side of the boar's neck. The other two huntsmen were still holding firmly to their spears. Before Robert could follow through with his cut, the boar unexpectedly squealed and sprung back up to its hooves. The beast charged furiously towards him, breaking the arrow still pierced above its eye on Robert's chin, goring Robert's arm and knocking him to the ground. Before the other hunters could properly react, the spears slid out from its side and the massive blood-soaked beast ran squealing, disappearing into the dense forest. The two knights dropped their spears and rushed to Robert's aid, helping him to his feet. Robert shook them off of him and ran to Alfred's. Kneeling beside Alfred, Robert began weeping. Moments later, the second hunting party arrived with Lord Theophano. A knight ran to the lord and nervously filled him in on the grave situation. "What has happened here?" Theophano said gruffly, almost shouting at the knight. The knight spoke frantically before being interrupted. "My lord, it's the beast. It's your son and Robert. They tried to take the beast, the boar, and it got after them. You're Alfred Hayes." "Alfred, where is he?" Theophano commanded. The Lord quickly dismounted, and the now speechless knight guided him to his wounded son. A short way off, 2 knights were cutting down saplings and fashioning a simple cot to move Alfred's body. The monk was praying and examining Alfred when Theophano arrived. Robert was still kneeling next to his son, weeping and uttering an indiscernible prayer. Alfred's face was white as clean sheep's wool, his body twitching randomly. His leg would straighten and tense, then relax, his fingers and arms doing the same, randomly, weakly, digging into the ground around him. His left eye dangled from its socket and stretched the optic nerve out the side of his face. Above a crushed and bloody, curdled, cavernous wound that was once a cheekbone, his other eye rolled back and white. The monk held a cross in one hand and flung drops of purified river water at Alfred's face with the other, stopping as Lord Theophano arrived. "My lord, you mustn't see this," the monk said sorrowfully, beginning to stand. "You continue. He is my son, and I will see him as he is." The Lord interrupted loudly, expertly holding back tears. The monk froze with a red face, Theophano's unwavering gaze meeting him. "Yes, my lord," the monk bowed his head. "I think it would be best for him to be taken to the monastery, my lord. We have the best herb garden and many apothecally trained monks. If the beast imparted any wicked spirit that may hinder Alfred's healing, it will surely have no sanctuary there." The monk advised Lord Theophano as Alfred lay dripping with blood and holy water twitching in the dirt. Theophanos' gaze shifted to his son as he nodded gravely. Leofano called off the hunt as 2 squires arrived with bandages soaking in a wooden bowl. Robert protested to Alfred's father. Filled with rage, Robert vowed to Theo that he would find and kill the beast. Theophano sullenly commanded him to still his anger. "Calm yourself, Sir Robert. Now is the time to care for Alfred, not hunt." Bandaging Alfred, one of the squires peeled the pus and blood-soaked eye off Alfred's temple, gently sinking it into the gaping wound, approximating where he believed the eye should be. Then placed a clean cloth over the wound, using bandages to secure it to his face. Alfred breathed softly. The party carted Alfred away on a cot, held between 2 horses, and the huntsmen made their way back, exchanging their perspectives on the events of the day. Leofano went with Alfred to the monastery and stayed there with his mortally wounded son. Arriving at the village, the rest of the hunting party corralled as many of the townsfolk as they could to the town square. The town bishop stood atop a raised platform at the center road. The bishop informed them of the cancellation of the day's festivities and the tragic outcome of the day's hunt. At the monastery, Theophano sat in a chair next to Alfred, nearly breathless and unconscious in bed. Talking to him, Theophano went on till he fell into a deep sleep in his seat. A servant warmed the Lord by draping a thick wool blanket over him, and soon Leofano was in a deep sleep, dreaming. Theo and his son were common folk, living in a circular stone hut. Theophano added a log to the crackling fire before walking outside to call to his son. Stepping outside, he witnessed Alfred, squirming and moaning on the ground in pain as a boar gored and mangled his face. Theophano screamed, "Alfred!" Simultaneously, the massive beast bit down with a loud crunch on Alfred's face and quickly looked up at Theophano as the door to their small stone hut slammed behind him. Theo froze, unable to move, gazing at the boar standing above his son's motionless body, the monstrosity drooling red and snarling as it stared back at him. The Lord grabbed the handle behind him, trying to open the door and run back in before the boar could charge. As the boar began to charge, Theo managed to turn the handle and retreated into the hut, his body moving in slow motion as if he was trudging through shoulder-high mud. He made his way inside, closing and latching the door just as the great boar slammed its tusks against it. Through gaps in the wooden planks he could see it growling. Theo slowly stepped backwards, staring fearfully with wide eyes at the door. The boar continually marched back, then charged. The door creaked on its hinges, boards splintering and cracking with every collision. The animal seemingly grew in size with every impact. Startled, Lord Theophano fell backwards onto his back, quickly propping himself up with his hand. Theo sat there trembling with fear. With another charge, the beast slammed the door, shattering it to pieces, splinters flying all across the room as the room itself trembled. The beast swung its head side to side violently in the doorway, its massive tusks scoring the stone walls. Its body was now so massive it could not charge in at Theo. Squeezing its head back out from the entrance, the beast marched back again and charged. The whole building shook. Stones fractured as dust rained down from the ceiling. Looking for an escape, the hut had now become a tower, and a staircase spiraled across the stone walls to the top. Dread sprung Theo back to his feet, running fearfully up the steps. The boar continued ramming. The tower bent and cracked as the boar furiously rammed the structure. Reaching the top, Theo gazed out a stone port, contemplating jumping out, knowing the building would surely collapse as it quaked around him. Turning away, gazing back down from the top, the boar charged again, and with a tremendous crash, the tower shook around him once more. Looking forward, he could see a large bell reigning atop the tower as it began to crumble. Lord Theo woke the next day to the monastery bells. The noble master, Alfred, had passed. At the sight of Alfred's breathless body, the Lord called to his son in disbelief. "Alfred! Alfred!" He kneeled beside him, collapsing off his chair, fearfully grabbing Alfred's cold hand, pressing it to his chest. Grievously Leofano wept. "Alfred, Alfred, my son." "Oh, Alfred, my boy." Tears poured down Theo's chin, drenching his hands, clenching the cold white hand of Alfred. Monks prayed over Alfred and attempted to console the Lord, but to no avail. With the resolve of newly felt grief, Theophano went back to the castle and assembled the best knights and huntsmen. He ordered a party to go back into the king's forest and find the boar. They were not to return without the boar's head and pelt. Robert cried out from among them. He swore to Lord Theophano it would be himself that would return with the vanquished beast in honor of Alfred. And again the hunting party prepared their armaments and again left for the forest. In waiting, Leofano mourned and prepared to bury his noble son. 3 days passed, and the preparations were complete. However, no word had come back from the hunting party. Leofano resolved to postpone the burial till the arrival of Alfred's knights and closest friends that had embarked with the party. Another 3 days, and it was the day of Alfred's funeral, and it could not be postponed any farther. After the funeral, Lord Leo sent out a small party of men to contact the hunting party and bring back word of their mission. However, 2 days passed and still no word from either group of men. Early one morning, as a serf was tending to the crop, he saw a badly injured man, laying with his back against the goat pen. The man was dressed in huntsman grey garb, and was badly injured, his grey cowl soaked with blood. As he approached, the farmhand could see the man was still breathing. He shouted to his wife to go get help as he stayed with the mortally injured huntsman. The man remained unconscious as he was brought back to the castle and cared for. His wounds being so grave, many feared he would not survive the day. His body was scattered with tusk wounds and bite marks. Large pieces of skin torn from his thighs and hands, tusk wounds pocking his abdomen and arms. But in spite of the injuries, he woke a few hours later. The man explained to a physician that he was a member of the secondary party Lord Theophano had sent out for communication with the first. When Lord Theophano was informed, he quickly went to see the man. When he was well enough to speak again, the man informed Lord Theo the hunting party had been killed. They were being eaten by a pack of boar when their party had found them, and on their way back to give word of this, they also were attacked. He continued, explaining to the Lord. He had barely made it back with his life by climbing a tree after being brutally attacked by several boar, and waited there watching the boars finish killing and eating his companions. Upon hearing this, the Lord ordered the man receive the best available care, and Lord Theophano left to take counsel with his advisors and the clergy. The conclusion of the council was to write a letter to the king, informing him that evil had fallen upon their hunting ground and taken his son and 27 others. He asked for whatever aid the king could afford. The letter was sent, and a month later the king sent back word that he would send a group of talented huntsmen from a nearby township to help in their efforts. A few weeks went by, and soon the hunting party arrived. Again Lord Theophano assembled them and the newcomers, and they were sent into the forest. A month passed, and they did not return, but the Lord did not dare to send more men out for them. Enraged, he sent another message to the king. He implored the king, asking permission to cut down the forest from front to back, reasoning it would be a great resource of timber and farmland for the kingdom, even a possible quarry, and they would flush out and kill the beast to rid their kingdom from this evil in the name of God. After some time the king wrote back. They were permitted to cut down only a sixth of the forest and establish a forester camp, and that was all. He would send a party of some of his best foresters to oversee the operation and construction of the camp. The forest would be made a reserve, and hunting would no longer be permitted in this area till further notice. Lord Theophano knew this meant no hunting in this forest indefinitely. He angrily considered refusing the king's order in honor of his son and going into the forest himself with his best men, but was too afraid not of the king's judgment, but of the demon boar that Theophano was now certain to have plagued the forest. Chapter 2. Raid. 5 years later, pulled by 2 donkeys down a meandering oak-forested dirt road, a small wagon's wheels turned slowly on damp earth. 4 bandits lurked in hiding, ready for violence and loot. Raiders Jade and Thomas hunched behind a fern bush, waiting for the wagon to get close enough. Hiding behind a tree on the other side of the road, Aaron and Kevin tried to remain quiet while they almost silently fought over a piece of overcooked dry meat. A short way back up the road, a tradesman approached, sat at the front of his wagon, guiding the donkeys down the muddy path. He smoked fine pipe tobacco, softly humming to himself, shaded from the evening's drizzling rain by his cart. The donkeys pulling the small wagon were aware of the man's perceived superiority over them, and they agreed amongst themselves that it was in fact them leading. Moving the cart with the triad's men's wares to the next town, as it's usually not the case that one leads from behind, but usually said nothing about this. During the beginning of their career with their tradesmen, they would sometimes try to guide the wagon out of the way of large stones or dips in the road. But as they did this, the tradesmen would almost always whip them and pull on their stirrups, aligning them to the path, but also back into the path of whatever obstacle they had been trying to avoid. Shortly after this, the wagon would jolt and shake side to side, having not avoided the obstacle in the road. The donkeys would hee-haw, saying to the man, "See, you fool." The man, not understanding his donkeys, figured the thrashing of the wagon and hee-hawing was due to the, he thought, stupid donkeys trying to drive him and his goods off the road. After about a month of this ridiculous behavior, the donkeys decided to not help so much. Now the trips were more bumpy, but without the hee-hawing or abrupt changes in direction. The tradesmen did not notice much, and the donkeys did not get whipped as frequently. The donkeys considered this to be a win. Soon the wagon was close. Jade and Thomas ran out from behind the bush into the road, blocking the two beasts of burden. The wagon, jolted and clamouring with the sound of boxes and clay pots, stopped abruptly. The two men armed with crossbows pointed their weapons at the tradesman. The donkeys thought this was a very rude way to introduce oneself. This sort of abrupt running onto the road in front of a moving cart's behaviour they had only observed in the behaviour of human children. But they said nothing, assuming these possibly overgrown human children might be friends of their tradesmen, and not wanting to be rude themselves or whipped, they stopped. Jade whistled a piercing key, and Aaron and Kevin finished up their scrimmage over the piece of meat. Kevin slapped Aaron's hand, and Aaron slapped Kevin's nose hard, grabbing the piece of meat from him, shoving it into his mouth, and running out into the road behind the cart with a full mouth and a wicked grin. Kevin held back tears as he followed Aaron. At the front, Jade and Thomas smiled, staring at the tradesmen when they noticed their companions, Aaron and Kevin, rummaging through the back of the cart. Hearing the rummaging, the tradesman half turned his head to one side, so he could see the men behind him with the corner of one eye, and the two men with crossbows pointed at him with the corner of the other. "Oh, 2 buckets of horse shit," the tradesman yelled. Out of reflex to his frustration, he impulsively whipped one of the donkeys. The donkey tried restraining its heeing, instead letting out a silent yet high-pitched haw, and stomped its hooves at the ground. Startled by this sudden movement, Thomas jolted back, pulling on the trigger of his bow. The bolt flew through the RE, stopping half protruding from the tradesman's chest. With a deep inhale, the ember in the man's pipe shone brightly, then the pipe fell from his mouth. He grunted, letting out a large puff of smoke, wearing a wide-eyed, shocked expression, and fell over onto the muddy dirt road, dead. Jade looked over at Thomas seriously. Aaron and Kevin froze and stared wide-eyed through the back of the wagon out to the front at Jade and Thomas. At the back of the cart, Kevin grabbed the handle of his sword, but Aaron stopped him from unsheathing it. Both of them with gazes fixed at Thomas and Jade. "2 buckets of horse shit," shouted Jade, and laughed loudly. They all started laughing almost uncontrollably. Amidst the laughter, the donkey on the right cautiously glanced over at their tradesman's lifeless body. She silently hawed to her companion, "I don't think they were friends." The men rummaged through the wagon, taking the loot to their camp, and set the donkeys free after debating whether or not to eat them. They divided everything amongst themselves and separated to sell the goods in the nearby towns, then reconvened at a tavern to plan their next raid and to celebrate and spend their ill-gotten gains. The 4 brigands arrived at the tavern of the Horse Chaser, walking in with an air of salty panache, and made their way to a table glossed with beer, wine, and some other undiscernible liquid at the back corner of the room. Thomas shouted across the table to the bar, "Maid, maid," and motioned with his arm. When the wench arrived, Jade said, "Yes, maid, 4 pottages for me and my men," in a slovenly romantic voice, "and 4 beers also." Double Aaron interrupted with a grunt, "Ay, that'll be 5 beers." "And that'll be 10 and 5 pints, the wench said. Jade dropped some coins in the woman's rough hands and eyed her as she went behind the bar for the beers. The woman brought back the beers, placing them on the table for each of the men. Setting the last one down, she inadvertently made eye contact with Kevin, who was smiling at her with a toothy black and yellow grin. She ignored him and left to the kitchen to retrieve the pottage. Jade glanced at the bar again when he noticed an old friend and raid companion sitting at the counter. Jade scooted out his chair. "A moment, fellas," he said aloud. He walked over to the bar and slapped the man on the back at the shoulder. The man jolted, almost knocking over his drink. His bar stool wobbled. Stilling himself, he quickly turned to face Jade, wearing a startled expression, his hand at his side ready to unsheath his knife if need be. He turned his startled expression to the gruffest face he could muster and stared with wide, dark eyes at Jade. Jade glared back, mocking his violent expression for a moment. Then Jade smiled, a tarnished, snaggle-toothed grin behind his blackened, unkempt beard. Harold. Jade tauntingly, hollowly exclaimed. Harold eyed Jade's face, trying to recognize the man, weighing him as friend or foe. When he recognized Jade, his gruff expression faded. "Good bounty?" Jade said to Harold haughtily. And before Harold could answer, Jade went on. "What's with the longbow?" he said, staring at the counter next to him. Harold had a longbow leaning on the bar and a quill of arrows on his waist. "You're poaching now?" Jade sarcastically laughed and took 2 gulps of beer. "Actually, yes," Harold said. "Really?" Jade said, almost choking, spitting a few droplets of beer. Harold just looked at him with certainty and nodded. "Really?" Jade said, proudly disbelieving, and leaned on the counter. "Well," Harold almost answered before Jade interrupted his first word. "Come sit with us," Jade asked, motioning to their table with a mug of beer in his hand as he stumbled a bit, taking a few small steps in that direction. Then looked back at Harold. Harold nodded with a slight smile, got up from his seat and grabbed his bow. Jade happily started walking to the table, remembering past raids he'd gone on with his old friend, already formulating fragments of the next one, including Harold. When they got to the table, Jade introduced Harold to his companions. Harold grabbed a chair from a nearby table and sat with the outlaws. The bear maid brought their pottage, setting the bowls down one by one around the table. Kevin stared at her longingly, saying, "The pottage smells fantastic." When she turned to him with his bowl, he was unabashedly staring at her chest. "You must have made it special for me." Kevin flirted. The barmaid stared back at him, anger and embarrassment flushing her now red face. "Yes, I made it special for you with a special ingredient." "And what's that dairy?" Kevin asked, accentuating every word romantically, still staring beams at her chest. The woman stared with furrowed brow. "Sheep's dung, for your purity, sir," she said, fuming, and dropped the bowl on the table in front of him. He startled and looked at her face. He tried to make a handsome expression, somehow oblivious to her frustration, still believing he had a chance. She pursed her lips, bringing saliva to the front of her mouth to spit, but decided against it. She turned about abruptly and walked back to the kitchen, Kevin's eyes following her. Next to Kevin, Thomas was shoveling pottage into his mouth, not taking a breath between mouthfuls of pottage and glugs of beer. Jade and Aaron were looking at Kevin, smiling foolishly. Harold sipped his beer, trying to ignore the situation. Kevin looked back at his companions, still wearing his handsome face. "She's good, huh?" Kevin said, lifting his brow. Harold lightly laughed, looking at his beer. "Yeah, I think she likes you," Aaron said. Jade laughed mid-gulp, choked and misted the entire table. "What do you know, Aaron?" "When was the last time I saw you with a woman?" Kevin looked up thoughtful, then back down at Aaron. "That's right, never," Kevin said triumphantly, tilting his head to one side. "That's because I have the good sense to buy a room before I bed them with my eyes," Aaron retorted. Kevin looked over at the woman as she served another table and sipped his drink, ignoring Aaron. Jade slammed his cup on the table. "My friend Harold here is a huntsman now. Tell us, how is it being a huntsman, Harold?" he said, still not entirely believing Harold's new chosen profession. Harold set down his cup to speak. "It's patient work, and I don't bounty as much as I did finding, but I spend less and save more," said Harold. "How did you get to hunting?" "Only knights and guildsmen are permitted to? I think you mean poaching," Thomas asked loudly, stopping between each other word to fill his mouth with pottage. Yes, and how can you have more if you make less? Jade added, laughing sarcastically. Don't make sense. Well, I was not a guildsman, and certainly not born into knighthood, or any trade. Obviously, Kevin interrupted, still staring across the room. Yes, I actually did start as a poacher, said Harold. Stealing from the king's forest is much more treacherous than finding why not come with us on the next bounty, Jade said. Well, not as treacherous as you might think. As long as you have the right weapons and skill. As I was saying, I started as a poacher, but I'm a real huntsman now, part of a guild and all, said Harold. Yeah, and tell us, how did you accomplish that? Asked Aaron, now also in disbelief. Well, I had been poaching deer in a reservation while I was settling my camp. Before nightfall, I caught sight of a large buck. I got my bow and began sighting it. I suppose I had been so distracted by the thought of such a glorious beast that I did not notice I was being tracked myself by a group of foresters. By the time I noticed them, they were already calling me to halt, at which point I thought of running, but when I looked back at the buck, it had already been taken, and several more foresters were already walking towards me from its direction with their bows drawn at me. Harold explained. At this point, Kevin, Aaron and Jade were now staring at Harold, listening intently, as well as Thomas no longer stuffing himself. Well, they took my weapons and brought me back to their camp. I thought for certain that they would take me back to the township for punishment, but they just sat me down around their hearth and talked. They even gave me a portion of the venison they had taken. Well, I got to talking to the lead of the camp. He told me they had gotten sight of me 3 days prior. I asked him why they had not just taken me then, or while I was settling my camp. He explained they would have, and that the law in this forest, as it was a reservation, was to shoot on sight. But when he and his fellows saw the way I had been tracking, he ordered them not to fire on me. Apparently, he had been impressed. I had been taught to hunt by my uncle, you see, and apparently some of my techniques were foreign to them. Well, he offered that if I hunt with him and his men till they could learn the technique, that I could leave the forest with my life. And, well, I accepted. Aaron nodded, returning to slowly spoon his pottage. After a few weeks, he made me another offer. He said if I wanted to stay, he would contact a friend of his at Guild, and he would have papers made to signify me as a real forester. Or I could stay till his men had mastered the new techniques, and then he would have me killed, though I think he was joking about that last part. Harold nervously laughed. And so you agreed? Jade asked, half frowning. Yes, of course. I go by Philip now. What brings you to town then, Philip, getting your arrows gilded? Kevin snapped back. He wants to know how much you get paid, said Jade. Yes, I understood that. But it's unkind to talk of coins in company. They pay me well enough. Besides, they've increased patrols of all the main travelling routes. Fiending is too risky these days, Philip replied. And how do you figure that? Asked Thomas, slightly annoyed at the thought. Information is one perk of working for the crown. Though it's not quite useful to me, I suppose, Harold admonished. A good friend in our days, and a good friend to have even now, Jade kindly expressed with a rasp. We have no fear of Meerguard patrols. Any one of us could take 5 of them, Kevin interjected, smirking pridefully. Yes, at least 5, said Thomas. Well, no matter what, hunting is a fine skill. I remember being short of food at times in my days of finding. Having the skill to at least set traps came in great use for me and my fellows, Harold regaled. I'll be in town for another days. Could show you some traps and supplies if you would be interested. It would be nice to have more food on the road, Kevin said, salivating. I agree, said Jade. At least one of us should learn. All agreed. Yes, Kevin said excitedly. Aaron agreed. Thomas nodded somberly. "Then it's for sure. Where shall we meet you tomorrow?" Jade asked. "I'll be at the cartographer's house tomorrow evening if we don't cross paths sooner," agreed Jade said, smiling. "Here's to learning a new skill," Thomas said, raising his glass. "And more food," Kevin added. "And to the next bounty," Jade shouted. The men cheersed and spent the night drinking before making their way to the town's inn to rest. All of them drunkenly expectant for tomorrow's preparations and the prospect of a new, possibly life-changing skill. Chapter 3. New Opportunities. Jade lay drooling on a straw pillow before awaking with a snorting inhale early the next day. Rolling himself over off the cot onto the floor, he hobbled to his feet, head pounding and still slightly drunk from the previous night. He stumbled over to Aaron, trying to find his balance, and gave him a kick. "Aaron, get up," he said with abandon. Aaron snorted and turned. Jade gave him another nudge with his foot. "Aaron, wake!" He said again, this time louder, and stood there lightly swaying. Aaron rolled onto his back and grimaced, staring up at Jade. "Aaron, wake the others and get them ready," Jade murmured. "I'll meet you all at the market in a few hours." Aaron straightened himself out in his bed, rubbed his eyes and nodded in agreement with a sigh. Jade stared at Aaron inquisitively. "Yeah," Aaron said, inhaling. Jade nodded, then stretched his arms and with stiff legs left the room. A while later, Jade was standing in a muddy path at the edge of town talking to a well-dressed man. "And you're sure they're not hiring any guards?" Jade asked threateningly. "I think not, just a regular migratory caravan. But still worth finding," the well-dressed man admonished. "All right, then here you go," Jade said, reaching his hand in his pocket. The man's face went flush and he took a step back. Jade grimaced, pulling his hand from his purse and shaking it at the man to take. "Oh," the man muttered. "Come on," Jade said, simultaneously. The man fumbled his hands across his chest, then finally reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crumpled paper with writing on it. Jade dropped the coin in his hand as he grabbed the parchment from him with his other. "A joy making trade with you," Jade said, smiling and frowning all at once. He tried to keep both eyes open for a fierce stare while he fought through the pounding in his head and the urge to burp. "And you," the man said, forcing a smile, and stood there holding on to the bottom of his collared tunic with two hands. "Ugh," Jade shrugged, turning away from the man and making his way back to town. Thomas, Kevin and Aaron wandered around the open market gathering supplies for themselves. Aaron purchased a bag of thinly sliced dried peppered meats, a jar of honey, some new gloves and thin hard salted bread wrapped in cloth. Thomas argued with the archery merchant. "The house arrows! The house arrows!" Thomas shouted in frustration. The merchant stood behind the counter with a bewildered look on his face. The confused man motioned with his hands to a bunching of red-wrapped black bolts in a small barrel beside him. "No, the house there, right there," Thomas said loudly, his voice cracking out of frustration. The man motioned to another barrel at the opposite side of him with wide eyes. "Are you mad?" Thomas blurted. He went on, shaking his hand and arms in the direction of the house arrows, with the square barbed tips. The merchant put his hands on his hips and stared at Thomas. "Now there's no need for that," he said. Thomas blinked and shook his eyes from side to side in disbelief. "Need for what?" "Well, the harsh language," the man said with a long, slightly sorrowful face. "My third cousin is mad and—" the merchant defended before being interrupted by Thomas slamming his fist on the table. Before Thomas could explode at the merchant, Kevin appeared next to him and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "What's with all the commotion, Thomas?" Kevin asked casually and cleared his throat. "This hedgeborn doesn't understand simple English." The merchant inflated his cheeks and blew out hard, making a puffing sound, and made a shooing motion with his hands. "What are you looking for, Thomas?" "Not a fight, I hope," Kevin asked. "No, just a dozen or so house arrows," Thomas replied, grimacing at the man behind the counter. Sevin clapped his hands at the man to draw his attention. 13 house arrows, Kevin pointed at the house bolts behind the man. Immediately the man's face lightened. He turned his nose up at Thomas, turned and selected 13 house bolts and handed them to Kevin. Kevin smiled and made a pleasant nod to the man in receiving them. "What?" Thomas emoted. "Well, pay the man, Thomas," Kevin insisted. Thomas growled and gave the man some pence. The man took the coins and kindly nodded to Thomas with a pleasant expression. As Thomas and Kevin left, they could hear the merchant mutter a curse at them. "Coxcomb," the man said. Thomas was about to turn, but Kevin put his arm around him and guided him forward. Kevin tapped his elbow on his back and shouted, "Base, low-born, illegitimate." The two companions laughed and walked over to Aaron, where he was buying pig lard at another stall. About an hour later, Jade and Philip met with the others sitting at a food stall. "Boys," Jade greeted the men and sat with them. "Oi, Jade," said Thomas. "Philip here is going to join us to the next town on his way back to his nobles' camp. And he'll be showing us a thing or two about hunting along the way," Jade stated with a slight excitement the men had not often seen in him before. "Welcome to the party, Philip," Aaron said, agreeing. "For now," Kevin added, with a feeling of unacknowledged jealousy. "Yes, thank you. Have you all got enough from the market, like I asked Aaron to tell you to?" Aaron looked at the others while nodding. Philip interjected, "Actually, we will need to buy a few more things. A longbow, proper gutting and skinning knives, some rope and a few more. I hope you all haven't spent all your funds." "Half funds," Kevin laughed. "Almost," said Aaron. "Still have a bit left," Thomas said reluctantly. "Well, we will all have to pitch in then. It will be a benefit to all of us, remember." Jade sternly reminded the men. Kevin and Thomas nodded. Philip guided the men around the market, explaining to them as much as he could about the skill of hunting in the time they had that day. They all spent another night drinking at the tavern of the Horse Chaser and left in the direction of Philip's camp late the next day. Along the way, Philip and the bandits trained in the craft of hunting and laying traps. By the end of the 21-day trip, Jade and Thomas were proficient with the longbow. Aaron and Kevin were well enough at it, Aaron showing more of a proclivity for trap laying, while Kevin displayed an even mediocrity for both skills. Upon failing at some exercise, he would often stab his knife into the ground in frustration, then yell, "The horror!" then clean it off and sheath it. Aside from this oddity, the training went smoothly. A few nights before the end of the brigand's journey with Philip, the men talked, sitting around a fire at the side of the road. Jade asked Philip if he knew of any good poaching spots near their destination. Thomas told Jade of a forest. "There is a forest about 30 or so miles to the south of our local village, and hunting there is no longer permitted and hasn't been for the past several years, so there must be plenty of game. However," Philip added cautiously. "What?" Jade asked. "Well, there is a camp of foresters there, just about 20 or so men for the over 2,000 acres, Philip said slowly. "Oh, aye, that's not too bad, eh? Jade replied, giving a look of approval to Aaron and Thomas. "But that's not all, you see." "Well, out with it, man," Jade interrupted Philip. "It's nothing bad, really. It's just that some people say the place is cursed." Philip finished with a slight smile. "Cursed how?" Jade asked, thoughtfully stroking his beard. "Well, I'm not really sure. Just heard tell of a curse, not sure why," Philip responded. Just then, Kevin shivered and scared himself. "Well, that's just fine. "We ain't scared of no ghosts," Jade said proudly, in an almost sing-song voice. "Isn't that right, men?" They all nodded and mumbled in agreement. "Well, that's well and good. We can talk more about it tomorrow. I'm turning in for the night." "Rest well, gents," Philip said, and left for his tent. That night, it rained. And in the morning, after more conversation, the men all agreed to forego their robbing the migrating caravan and instead overtake the foresters' camp in the haunted forest. And if they could not take the camp, they reasoned, they could always just do some poaching nearby. Philip drew them up some directions, and after parting ways, the 4 men started on their journey to the forest, expecting to try out their new skills and maybe see some action finding some forester camp loot. End of first installment. In the next half, the 4 bandits, Jade, Kevin, Aaron, and Thomas, attempt to overtake the foresters' camp as they enter the forest of the Demon Boar.
Hey guys, hope you enjoyed the first half of the story Bandits and Boars. Next half should be coming out around Halloween. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and share it everywhere you can. Writing horror stories is a passion of mine and I hope to get paid for it one day. Check back for more coming soon. God bless and stay golden.